Until 1913, patients suffering from nervous or mental disorders who lived in the Gateshead area were accommodated in Gateshead Mental Hospital, Sedgefield. When the Durham Authority terminated the contract, requiring the beds for their own patients, Gateshead decided to provide its own mental hospital. After inspecting several sites, West Duddow, Stannington was chosen, and 300 acres of land was purchased from Mr. Thomas Scott for £9,221. The building of the hospital was to cost a further £114,000. West Duddow lies close to the A1, 4 miles south of Morpeth, with Newcastle a further 12 miles away. It would provide ample space for development in a peaceful rural setting. Designed by Hine and Pegg of Westminster and built by Moss and Sons of Loughborough, Gateshead County Borough Asylum opened in January 1914. The hospital was predominantly of 2 stories, its main entrance being through the administration block, beyond which corridors to left and right led to the main wards, male to the left, female to the right. In this building were to be found the medical officers and stewards' offices, the dispensary and reception areas, and the committee room, where the visiting committee met monthly to discuss the running of the hospital. The central section of the hospital housed the storeroom. Across a yard were to be found the butcher's shop, coal store, and the bakehouse. The bakehouse was a 2-story building, the upper floor being used as a flour store, serviced by an electric hoist. Originally, its walls were lined with white glazed tiles. The oven, installed by Werner Pfleiderer and Company of Peterborough, produced all the bread and confectionery requirements of the hospital. The butcher's shop and coal store had doors which opened onto a small kitchen yard and then onto the main kitchen, which was originally fitted with coal-fired ranges, ovens and large steamers for cooking vegetables. The recreation hall, with its well-appointed stage, was of a good size and lit on both sides by stained glass windows. A cinema projection room was added early in 1924. It showed its first film in December of that year. On the male side of the hospital were the tailors, upholsterers and cobblers' shops, which had access to the main buildings, but also opened onto the engineer's yard. The laundry was on the female side, and was in fact 3 laundries. The general laundry for patients' clothes, the fowl washhouse, and the officers' washhouse for staff clothing. Close to the laundry was the sewing room, where repairs were carried out. Like the laundry, it was always very busy. 10 wards formed the south side of the hospital. There were 5 male wards and 5 female wards, overlooking the lawns and recreational field. Each ward was complete in itself, comprising of a dormitory, day room and attendance room, a scullery and kitchen and storeroom, as well as a bathroom and toilets. At the east and west ends of the ward complex were the general bathrooms. To the east of the administration building lay the engineering plant, dominated by the great 83-foot-high water tower. Around the tower were to be found the painters, plumbers, joiners and fitters' shops. Two Lancashire steam boilers drove the dynamos, which provided all the steam to generate electricity for the hospital, as well as the heating and hot water requirements. The water tower contained the cold water tanks, filled with water raised from a 35 feet deep well, which was sunk in the pump house. 3 electrically driven pumps delivered 15,000 gallons of water daily. Above the administration building, the turret clock chimed out the hours of the day with its 200-weight bell. The striking hammer was automatically cut off at night to prevent the patients being disturbed. Some distance to the north of the hospital lay the chapel, with seating for some 400 patients and staff. It provided services for Church of England, Roman Catholic and Nonconformist worshippers. Beyond the chapel, further north, was the isolation hospital, later to become the occupational therapy workshop. It had accommodation for 3 patients of each sex on either side of a 2-story building. Its central section housed attendance rooms, kitchen and scullery. Behind, in an enclosed yard, was a mortuary. Recruiting had begun early in 1913. Dr. John Tye, who had been Deputy Medical Superintendent at Clifton Asylum, Yorkshire, was appointed Medical Superintendent. Mr. William Winship from Morpeth Asylum became the first Clerk Steward. They were followed by Matron Jenny Taylor and Engineer George Bell. Together with nurses, attendants, technical and ancillary staff, by the end of 1914, they were administering to the needs of some 380 patients. Early in 1918, the hospital became involved with the casualties of the Great War. The Army Council required beds for the many sick and wounded returning from overseas. St. Mary's answered the call, and in May of that year, the civilian patients were moved out. The asylum became a military hospital, and the first casualties began to arrive in August. Dr. Tighe was appointed commanding officer with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the RAMC. Many of the staff were also enlisted in the medical corps, and these, together with soldiers from the RAMC, treated shell-shocked and neurasthenic war wounded until June 1919, when orders were received to close Stannington Military Hospital and transfer patients to the Northumberland War Hospital, Newcastle. For 9 months and 16 days, St. Mary's had served as a war hospital. With the Army personnel gone, the hospital returned to civilian use, and by October 1919, St. Mary's was once again in the hands of Gateshead Authority, with 243 patients. Not all staff remained in service at the hospital. Some enlisted and went to war. Robert Leppington was one of those who sadly did not return. He was killed in the trenches at Loos in France. A sergeant, he had served for just 13 months. While the hospital proved to be adequate for the needs of Gateshead, there was a gradual increase in requests from other authorities for beds. To meet this demand, it was decided to build a nurses' home, which would release space in the main hospital for additional beds. The new home was officially opened in June 1929 by Alderman William Clough, JP, who was chairman of the committee at this time. Sadly, Dr. Tighe was not to see this stage in the hospital's development. He died suddenly in the January of 1929 and was buried in Stannington Cemetery. The isolation hospital eventually became the base for the occupational therapy workshop. Quite when this occurred is difficult to say. It was in use in 1931 as a female working patients ward, and Dr. Brown, the new superintendent, had patients making mats and rugs for the wards. He was a keen advocate of patient employment, and the unit probably developed from this time, with patients working at a wide variety of crafts. The opening of Eldon House in 1939 as an admission and treatment centre was an attempt to meet the needs of current thinking. The need for separate units for the treatment of early cases, apart from the chronic, regressed and disturbed patients. The new building was formally opened on the 29th of June 1939 by Sir Lawrence Brock, CB, Chairman of the Board of Control. The Archdeacon of Northumberland, the Reverend L.S. Hunter, and the Reverend Charles Hudson, chaplain to the hospital, dedicated the building. Also present were Alderman Foster, chairman of the committee, the mayors of Gateshead and South Shields, Dr. Bamford, medical superintendent, and other officials. After inspecting the building, a reception was held on the lawn. Eldon lay to the north of the hospital and provided accommodation for 30 patients of each sex. In the centre were offices, operating theatre and X-ray facilities. A full-length corridor gave access to dormitories and day rooms. Other extensions were opened at the same time. 2 convalescent villas, Eden and Weir, were intended to house patients whose recovery was soon to lead to discharge. Cheviot House, to the west of the nurses' home, was one of 2 wards for parole patients. Ashley House, which lay on the southeast side of the estate, fulfilled a similar role. As the name implies, parole patients required less supervision and had a much greater freedom of movement. It was to be some time before St. Mary's would feel the benefit of Eldon House. Almost immediately, it was taken over for the treatment of military and civilian casualties. Between December 1939 and February 1940, hutments were erected to the north of Eldon, and under the name Gateshead Emergency Hospital, later to be called Burnholme, it was used by the military on 2 separate occasions, and by the London County Council as a refuge for patients from the London bombing. Finally vacated in May 1945, it was used for a period as a storage facility by the Ministry of Food, until part of it was converted into living accommodation for hospital staff. St. Nicholas's, Newcastle, used it for psychiatric patients until 1973, when part of it was used as a spillover for St. Mary's. The hutments were demolished in 1993. In June 1963, the nurses' teaching unit was completed and ready for occupation. Here, staff were able to follow either a 2-year course to qualify as state-enrolled nurses or a 3-year registered mental nursing course. This ensured that staff leaving St. Mary's could readily be replaced. At the entrance to the hospital was accommodation for senior staff. The lodge was home to various doctors. Ravensworth, was the residence of the clerk steward, later to become the senior administrator. And across the drive, Royston House, which was the home of the medical superintendent. The chapel lay at the centre of the estate and played an important part in the life of the hospital. Available for Church of England, Roman Catholic and Nonconformist worship, in its early days it was well attended by patients and staff. Its first chaplain, the Reverend Doddridge, spoke of an enthusiastic congregation of 170 patients whose attendance was all that could be desired, combining reverence with keenness, and of singing that was hearty and congregational. After the death of Dr. Tighe, a lectern was purchased as a memorial to St. Mary's first medical superintendent. The chapel belfry housed one of two bells in the hospital and called patients and staff to worship. The second bell was hung in a gantry above the kitchen. It was rung to summon the outworking patients and staff to meals. The daily routines and social life of St. Mary's are not well documented, but through the recollections of past employees, we are able to gain an insight.
Breakfast was served at approximately 8 o'clock, and some patients had to be fed, and one nurse would be detailed to help, to assist them, to feed. The others were just supervised. After breakfast they were toileted, and some went to work. Usually the department that they went to work in, they collected them from the wards because they were on more or less parole, they were allowed to go out. The rest of the patients were assisting on the ward with the nurse, helped make beds, so help with the floors, because in those days the nurses had to do the domestic work as well. In some of the wards, apparently there was maids in other wards, but I can't remember ever seeing them at that time. But the wards I worked in, there was never any. And the nurse, the bottom nurse, used to have to see to the toilets, clean the toilets and wash basins and whatnot after breakfast, after the patients got away to work. The other patients helped you in the ward with what you were doing. And I think it was about 10:30 in the morning, we had to go out on the hearing court with them. And if it was warm, well, they would have it was for exercise, so we walked them around a few times, and then probably they'd just sit round, have a little game of something, if they were able to play games, and when we're out, and bat a ball, or just throw a ball about. That went on till about 3:30. Well, a good hour. They were out for a good hour. If it was fine, they were out for longer. And then by that time they brought in clothes and coats and things taken up and put away and then prepared for dinner.
Promoted in 1957, we decided to do a complete upgrading of the hospital. The decor at that time was in common with most institutions, brown and green, brown tiles halfway up the wall and then green paint above that. And the difficulty in the past had been that it was impossible to cover the brown tiles with anything. The only way to change the decor would have been to completely remove the tiles, and we were loath to do this. But then ICI developed a product which would form a base for the application of paint. So when we upgraded the hospital, we were able to use this system and completely change the colours of the walls. In the wards themselves, we had most beautiful pine flooring, which had to be what we call buffed by the patients. And we were faced with a difficult decision as to whether to retain these nice floors or whether to cover them with linoleum or vinyl covering in order to provide a little bit colour in the wards. In the end, we decided to go the whole hog and cover the pine floors, which we did. When we did the upgrade, of course, we completely changed the central heating system. Altered all the furniture, applied the curtains to the windows, and just gradually enlivened the whole hospital up, completely changed the internal decor.
When I first started here in 1950 as a student nurse, the nurse training facility was a room in the nurse's home, which was totally inadequate, of course, for the purposes, but was all that could be afforded at the time. However, early in 1950, a purpose-built school was erected on the west side of the hospital, which made an ideal nurse training feature. At that time, Jack Addison was the principal tutor, a very excellent tutor, and was a hard act to follow. But they did, and we turned out many good nurses over the years that the school was in progress. Initially, at first, it was a school of training for the State Register of Psychiatric Nurses, but as time evolved, there was such a shortage of nursing staff, they condensed the training to arrange for pupil nurses to be trained. This was the state enrolled nurse. These were the bedside nurse, and their function was to take away a lot of the tasks that the state registered nurse was doing over this period of time, and they went on to manage and run various wards and departments.
Staff and patient outings held an important place in hospital life, with the seaside a popular choice. Visits to Newbiggin, Cresswell, Whitley Bay, Mask and Blackpool gave much enjoyment.
Sports day at St Mary's Hospital was one of the highlights of the year regarding the patients and also the staff, also the visitors and patrons who all came along to participate in the annual sports day. And staff, male and female, all participated in all the events. Patients, staff and visitors all lined the running track, and you really had a full complement of people there. Various events like children's or school sports days were held, like the three-legged race, the sack race, the egg and spoon race, the running race,